So without further ado, Dave, I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction and for encouraging everyone to remind me about the dumbest thing I ever said in my professional career. So thanks for that. I'm Dave. Yes, I am very old, so I've seen a lot of things. And I want to talk to you today. The talk says humans, the missing manual, and that is true. But actually today what I want to do is give to you a mental model you can use to help manage people through uncertain times. A few months ago, when David asked me to speak today, things looked, let's say, more certain than they do in the world. So this, I guess, at least I guessed right on the topic. All right, so just like in, say, machine learning, a model for humans, for human cognition, has to have basically three properties. Has to be small enough to fit in memory, simple enough to reason over, actually if you want to be very precise, simple enough that it's not computationally expensive to execute. That's a better way to think about it. And durable, meaning it has to make predictions that last far enough in the future to make it worthwhile, right? I can have a model that tells me who's going to win an election if I have 99% of the votes counted. That is not a particularly durable model, right? That result only lasts a few seconds into the future. So the model I'm going to give you today has got exactly three pillars. Hopefully it will meet the criteria I've just outlined. But as with all models, we would like to keep in mind the sage advice of George Box. All models are wrong, including the one I'm going to tell you, but some of them are useful. And that's the goal today, is to give you a way to think about interacting with your employees, well, anyone really, that will be simple, you can reason through it, and it'll be durable into the future. All right, so although it is true that what I'm going to talk about today comes from work in the last few years about discoveries about human physiology, particularly how the brain works. We're not going to get into a lot of that. I have exactly one slide. There it is. But we do have to talk just a second about it, because if any of this is wrong, if any of this research is wrong, what I'm about to tell you is wrong. It's all built on top of it. I don't think it is, so I don't think it is. The best research today on how the brain works is happening at a company not far from here called Numenta, founded by a person named Jeff Hawkins. If you're old enough to remember what a Palm Pilot was, Jeff invented the Palm Pilot, but he was doing neuroscience before that. Very smart team, much smarter than me by a lot. I was going to point to, but it's not there. All right, so I guess it's there someplace. If you want to read all about it, you should read the book that they published last year, 1,000 Brains. If you optimize for time, which is my code for lazy, because I also do that, you can just grab that QR code and see like a 90-minute presentation from the Numenta team about the basics of the research and what they discovered. I'm going to do a terrible job of summarizing some of it for you today, but it's all useful. So let's talk for just a second about the brain. If I asked you what the brain does, you would tell me a bunch of things. They'd fall generally into two classes of things. The first are the autonomic functions, right? Those happen in the brainstem, which is right there, where your spinal cord meets your skull. It's the oldest part of the brain because it's basically the operating system of the brain. That's, heart rate, breathing, digestion, blood pressure, et cetera. All the autonomic things. That's why a blunt force trauma to your brainstem will kill you because it can't do those things. Whereas you can have damage to lots of other parts of the brain and live a very, productive, sometimes very interesting life. Lots of interesting stories about that. But the other part of the brain, in fact, the biggest part, starts at the front, wraps all the way around to the back, and if you were looking at a cross-section of the brain, you'd see a bunch of structures in the middle and then this wrapping around it, sort of like a Tootsie Pop. That's your cerebral cortex, 90% of which is made up of this thing called the neocortex. It's called the neocortex because it's the newest thing to have evolved in human beings. It's a little more than 75% of the mass of your brain, and the research the Numenta team has discovered and done, which is really fascinating, is of all the things the neocortex does, it's got your vision centers and your speech centers and your reasoning centers, et cetera, can all be distilled down to basically this. Its job is to predict the future, and it does that by building lots of models. From the day you were born to right this moment, it builds models, and that's how it predicts the future, and that's a really important thing to remember. So assuming all this is true, and I do think it is true, the evidence is pretty strong, that leads us, remember I said there are 3 basic pillars of the model I'm going to give you today. Here's the first one. Our brains do exactly 2 things. They keep the lights on, and they predict the future. That's it. If you want to really talk, because that's about 80% of the mass of the brain is dedicated to these things. So if you want to oversimplify what the human brain does in a useful way, that's a very useful oversimplification. It's the first thing to keep in mind. Okay. So now let's talk about, so that's whatever, interesting. That's the end of the physiology discussion. So now let's talk about our employees. Who are the kinds, we're in a knowledge business, who are the kinds of people we like to hire, and that we want to hire? Well, we hire smart people, right? That's what we test for in our hiring process, all of us. I've never been through the interview process at any of your firms, except for the one I work at. But I can already tell you right now, all of you at some point for every position in your firm are testing for general intelligence and abstract reasoning. All of you. So why do we value that? Well, it's actually in the definition of intelligence, right? We are looking for people who we can put into situations with which they are not completely familiar. They can reason their way through it, learn the lessons from it, apply it to relevant other domains, and move forward, right? That is kind of our definition of intelligence. Or, to go back a couple of slides, we're looking for people who are good at building models. But we're not looking for people who are good at building very situational or specific models. We're looking for people who are good at building general models. Let me give you this example. You know who else are excellent, I mean truly excellent brains for building models? Athletes. Think about an Olympic gymnast, someone like on the uneven bar, let's say. They have to build an unbelievably accurate model, physical model of their environment, how it connects to their body, then they have to direct their body to do it, and they have to do it within ridiculously small tolerances. Fractions of a millimeter, fractions of a second. You know, 1/10 of a second is the difference in a sport often between a gold medal and not being on the platform at all. And yet at no time in the history of Olympic sport has an interviewer ever said, "Congratulations on getting a perfect 10 on the uneven bars and winning a gold medal. Tell us, how did you get so intelligent?" That doesn't fit our sort of definition. So our definition of intelligence goes a bit further. I think it goes into sort of temporalness, right? That we can build models that are both flexible, meaning they're non-situational, and they last, they're durable into the future. And those are the kinds of employees we like to hire, right? We don't go out recruiting for Olympic gymnasts. We go out and test for people who can build these models and then use them in a flexible way. So we're looking for people with strong general intelligence, a general ability to do this, to reason in this way, plus some specific domain expertise. So people with high general intelligence who are good at negotiating might go into sales, who are good at communicating might go into marketing, who are good at telling computers to do things will become software engineers. That's a pretty broad but reasonable, I think, description of the kinds of humans we try to hire as employees. But here is the thing, this is true in every aspect of life. If you don't know this already, I don't know how long you've been on this planet, not very long. Everything costs something. And so the cost of being intelligent and having a lot of intelligent people is anxiety. There is a strong correlation all over the literature between the level of anxiousness someone will feel and their level of general intelligence, actually the level of abstract reasoning, if we want to be very specific about the literature. And so it's true, for every employee you have and every function you have in your company, you have people who are fantastic little anxiety machines. Now, we all know what anxiety feels like. Get my build to build. That's the, speaker's trick of using the dictionary definition. We all know what anxiety feels like. I don't have to spend any time on that. We should talk a minute about what the body does, though. There's some measurable physical things that happen when people feel anxious. We dump adrenaline. It speeds up our heart rate, makes our breathing more shallow, causes our pupils to dilate. I think we all understand that. So, oh my goodness, is that a lion in the bush? Should I run away? Kind of the response. We also dump cortisol. Cortisol is a really interesting chemical. It's misunderstood by a lot of people. It's often called the stress hormone. It is, but it does something a little different than people think. Cortisol is actually the chemical that makes it easier for your body to access its stored sugar, its stored glucose. Why do we do that? Well, if we think we might have to run very fast, we would like ready access to glucose. By the way, it's why we stress eat. So when we're feeling stress, we're feeling anxiety, our body's dumping cortisol and some amount of adrenaline. That happens, our body gets easier access to glucose, our body goes and takes advantage of that, starts burning that sugar. If that's happening for a few hours at a time, we run out of our supply. Suddenly we find we are super hungry, and what are we hungry for? Carbohydrates, things that'll get it. Like no one ever stress eats meat. That's, if you think about it, right? That doesn't, there's an old adage in the snack food industry that potato chips are the poor man's Xanax, and for a good reason. Like we go and we stress eat carbohydrates. So that's why, that's what happens physiologically. But here's the other thing, is why I'm going through all this with you. Here's the other thing that happens that we can demonstrate in testing. Ready? When we are feeling anxiety and we are in this condition, shallow breathing, we talked about heart rate, we have severely impaired ability for reasoning. When we are feeling anxious, we lose access to our higher reasoning functions in our brain. That's a medical fact. It's been demonstrated in labs all over the place. Now, there are a couple of competing theories about why this might be. There is, let's call it the physical theory or the physical model that says there's something about that combination of those two chemicals that impair some kind of pathway that don't let us get to that part of neocortex, or the neocortex that lets us do higher reasoning. I have no idea if it's true. They have some evidence to think that it probably is true, but they don't have a strong, like, why part of it, like how the thing actually works. There's another model, which you can kind of think of as the functional model, which is when we're feeling anxious, our brain spends all of its energy trying to resolve the anxiety. So it's like a computer whose CPU is spinning at 100%. It just doesn't have a lot of space to do other things. And they can see some evidence of that too, like they do functional MRIs of people having panic attacks. They can see reduced blood flows to the higher reasoning portions of the brain. So that seems like that could be true. I don't know which is true or which dominates. Also kind of, I don't care. I'm a big believer in embracing the power of and. So for this conversation, let's assume they're both true, because all that really matters is a medical truth, which is when people are anxious, they lose a lot of access to their ability to perform higher reasoning, which is a problem because that's what we hired them for in the first place, was to actually access those portions of their brain. So that brings us to our next pillar. I said there were three, right? The first one was our brain only does two things, keeps the lights on and predicts the future. Here's the second pillar of our model. Anxiety is the price of intelligence, and all anxiety comes from model invalidation. So why is anxiety the price of intelligence? Actually, if you think about this for a second, it makes pretty good sense. We have hired people who are really good model builders. Their brain is very good at building models that have some predictive value. Well, it means it can predict all the ways stuff will break and all the bad stuff that can happen too, right? We all have employees. Many of us have been in situations where we catastrophize over things that in the real world probably have low probabilities of actually happening, but we sweat about it a lot. That is the actual price of having good abstract reasoning ability. Those two things go hand in hand, because ain't nothing free in this world. And for the purpose of this conversation, while we could talk in flowery language about, well, you could get anxiety from this, and anxiety from that, and anxiety from this other thing, that's all fine. The truth of the matter is the root of all anxiety is uncertainty, and uncertainty comes from model invalidation. This is my assertion. To you, I don't know that it's perfectly true, going back to George Box's statement. In fact, I'm sure some of it is wrong, but for the purpose of you having something you can hold into your brain and use to make good predictions about how to interact with people, this works, as it turns out. Why do we care about that? Well, here's another thing to think about too. We're going to call this Dave's theory. I've never seen it written before, which is a metaphysical certainty. It's not true. But as a model goes, actually, it seems to work pretty well. The level of anxiety someone will feel will depend on the kind of invalidation that's happening. So if you think about your life, you've had some model in your brain about what was going to happen in the future. And then you discover something that invalidates that model. And when that happens, you feel some level of anxiety. We all do. And then you readjust based on your information, we move on with our day. But what happens when our model of the present gets invalidated? We see something in the corner, we're walking down the street, we see something in the corner of our eye that our brain worries maybe is a threat. Maybe someone's coming to mug me or something, I don't know, whatever. But something about our moment. Well, okay, first of all, we react very strongly and we feel a larger sense of immediacy and anxiety about it. Well, why is that? Well, I have a theory. My theory goes like this. When your model of the future becomes invalidated, that's one model that got invalidated. You got to do some work to fix it. When your model of the present gets invalidated, well, you got to fix that. which, by the way, just invalidated your model of the future. And oh, by the way, until you fix your model of the present, your ability to make any model about the future has just been invalidated too. That seems like that should cause more stress, and does seem to in people. Worse still is if we learn something that invalidates models of our past. So think about a time in your life, or if you've been fortunate enough to have this, where something you always held to be inviolably true through the course of your life, you have found out to be untrue. I don't know, you found out you were adopted at the age of 30 or something. That'll screw you up pretty bad. I was going to use a different word, but maybe I won't do that, they're recording. So that'll mess you up pretty bad. In fact, that will take years, if ever, to get over. It's a very traumatic kind of thing. You often need the help of a psychiatrist or some other professional to help you work through it. My theory is because, well, it's just invalidated all these models going backwards in time, which now have to be reconstructed until you can get to a good working model of the present, until you can get to a good working model of the future, which, by the way, is what 80% of your brain is supposed to be doing anyway. Like, that will screw you over pretty good. You need to keep this in mind when we talk about dealing with our employees. What are the things are we going to do, and what models in their brain is it going to invalidate? What kinds of anxiety are we going to be causing for them, and how do we avoid that? So that gets to our third pillar. Eventually. There it is. The job of a leader, all leaders, you, me, anyone you know, this is it, right here. The job of a leader is to lower the anxiety of our people by making it easier for them to successfully predict the future. If you only remember one thing from at least my part of this, that's it. Now, we need to talk about how do we do that? Well, actually, let's start with why do we want to do it? Well, because when they're anxious, they can't access the higher reasoning functions of their brain. That's what we paid them for. So, like, we're wasting money when they're anxious. So how do we do this? How do we make it easier for our employees to successfully predict the future? That sounds kind of daunting. Well, let's start with something easy. The way to not do it. The wrong way to do it is the way I think a lot of us, in a gut kind of reaction, would try to do, is the whole top-down, central planning, just do the thing I tell you and let me worry about the reason kind of way. That's not going to work for really two classes of reason. This first bit, anyone who's ever built a large distributed system can tell you. The problem with central planning or top-down planning, or whatever you want to think of it, is it places 100% of the modeling risk on the controlling unit, right? So if you build a large distributed system, that's my background, say of hundreds of computers spread across several miles, you will never have one computer in the center of it controlling everything and expect it to work pretty well. Why? Well, these systems will have emergent properties, meaning in combination with their environment, they will do things you had not thought of, that you could not have planned for, and those emergent properties will overwhelm your central node's ability to plan. The further spread apart they are, the longer it will take to get information back from the nodes or send instructions to them, right? So you've got a latency problem here, and in fact, the conditions may have changed by the time you can process and turn it around. Again, anyone who's ever built a large computing system will know this. So we know that any distributed system of a large number of nodes of any kind of distance is going to be brittle if you try to central plan it and have a single controller in the middle. That's why we distribute authority and control in any kind of system you can think of, consensus algorithms, whatever. We know all of this from computer science. This is now well documented. Yeah, here's the thing. Humans are not computers. Like, a computer will do exactly what you tell it to do. I can have 1,000 computers spread across 100 miles, and they'll do exactly what I tell them to do, even if I tell them to do the wrong thing. Yeah, humans aren't that way. Humans, no, but despite their best intention, will not do exactly what you tell them to do. They just won't. That's not how that works. So they're even like less reliable as nodes. This becomes even more brittle. So if you have any organization greater than, I don't know, 6 people, you can't do anything that looks like top-down. It's not going to work, or anything that has any distance. That's sort of the, we can reason about this from the computer science kind of a way. How about from a human way? Probably the oldest existing durable attribute in any model a human builds about themselves is that they are an independent actor in their environment. Our children learn from basically the day they are born, if they cry, we will pay attention to them. Then they learn how to use their hands, they can pick stuff up, their feet will get them a place. And in fact, that model, that part of that model is more durable than other things. Like, I can remember, when I was, 3 or 4 years old, and I know that my perspective was different because, well, I wasn't 6'1" at 3 or 4 years old. God help my mother if I had been, right? And my hair color has changed, sadly, and its density. And lots of things have changed about me that I might have thought of as a model of self, but my vision of being an independent actor in my environment hasn't changed. That's been consistent since pretty much the day I was born. So when you threaten someone's sense, basically their agency, you invalidate every model they've ever built of themselves. That is the guaranteed way to drive anxiety in people. Human beings will give up food, they will give up shelter, they will give up amorous partnership, let's say. Human beings will sacrifice their own life to regain agency. It's true. I mean, I don't necessarily want to touch on this completely, but we have all heard stories of people, well, actually, let's do it this way. You've read stories about people convicted of terrible crimes facing long jail sentences, and what's the first thing they do? They put them on suicide watch. Why? Because they're facing the prospect of losing their agency. And taking your life is like the most, whatever, control you can have. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but to give you a sense of how much human agency matters to people. So, we know this both from computer science and from basic experience with human beings. Top-down, central control kind of models for any non-trivial system are guaranteed to fail. They're guaranteed to be brittle, and at best, you'll get malicious compliance from your employees. Okay, cool, let's not do that. What should we do? I think the right answer looks like something like this. Principles down and results up. You can think of it this way. First, we should articulate a set of durable principles or objectives, depending on what we're talking about, that apply basically universally, everywhere and at all times, for whatever the situation is. Then we have to demonstrate, not just in our words, but in our actions, consistently and over time, that we are observing those principles or optimizing for those objectives. Because people will notice, and so if they notice what I do is different than what I told them ought to be done, they will learn that either there's a hidden principle they don't know, bad, invalidates all their models, or that I am a bad input. I'm a hypocrite. Like, so I'm a bad input. They can't count on my input to create regime certainty in their brains. Also increases anxiety. Of all the things we can talk about, the what's, the how's, the where's, the when's, the why is the most important thing. As a leader, if you're in any kind of position of management, from first-line manager to SVP of whatever, the most important thing you can spend your time on, you should be spending 90+% of it, is on the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Heck, when you talk to people and they come to you and say, I'd like your opinion about this design, why did you choose to do that? What were you optimizing for? As leaders, we are responsible for the following things, and only these things. We are responsible for principles, objectives, incentives, right? We want to declare a set of principles. How will we act? A set of objectives. What are we trying to achieve within the bounds of our principles, right? Constrained within our values. We're responsible for designing incentives that encourage people to go take actions towards those objectives within the bounds of our principles. Like, if you have a performance review process that doesn't actually explicitly look at your company's core values and how people are complying with them, you got a broken performance review process. Like, that's part of the incentives. And tie breaking, we're responsible for tie breaking. So I can give people a set of principles, I can tell them what objective we're marching to, I can be perfectly consistent, and then I can get two really smart people who disagree about the right thing to do to go in that direction. Their job is to tell me, my job is to pick one of those things. Then my job is to learn what did I need to be more clear about if that was the case. But in any case, even if I had been perfectly clear and they just found two completely reasonable solutions to the same problem, they have learned something about the way I reason about it, which will make it easier for them to pick a different thing next time. Anything else and everything else you can think of, whatever it is, you push to the edge. And by the edge, I mean your ICs. You push past your managers to the individual contributors in your org. Now, if you're in any kind of senior responsibility, which everyone in this room, I think, is, you know most of this, but how many of you are teaching this to your frontline managers, your first-time managers who are managing a team of 6 or 8 people? Because those people do have the ability, like they can hold the whole thing in their head, of getting into the details of this sprint, for example. We're going to do this versus that, and aren't taking to heart this admonishment about what they ought to be doing. And we need to be teaching those people by demonstration and by telling them those are our principles. So, in the 5-ish minutes I have left, let me go through a couple of examples. This is all kind of nice and flowery, but let's work through a couple ones. So this might be causing some anxiety for people these days, right? Everyone knows the economy is, well, in an interesting place, let's say. No one's quite sure what's going to happen next. So we could do what some companies do. I won't name them, I won't shame them out loud, but I've literally heard some companies do this where it's like, we know we're working on it. Yeah, you know what that does? Nothing. It encourages people to guess about what principles we're operating under. What's better is to say something like, okay, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen. No one's going to knows what happened, but here are the kind of models we're building for and the kind of principles we're following. So for example, I'm going to make this up. At Acme Corp, we raised $300 million 5 months ago. Our goal is in the next 18 months that we are cash flow positive, that money lasts us to cash flow positive, let's say, right? That means we have so many dollars today of ARR per employee, and we've got to do 30% more. We've got to do 130% of that per employee. Our sales are growing at the following rate. We are modeling scenarios where if our sales growth continues at the current rate, or if it continues at, let's say, half the rate, what do we need to do? Now you've told people what principles we're following or what objectives we have. You can give them the data. Here's what our sales were last month. And then when we say things like, we're going to freeze hiring for the next 2 quarters. Why are we freezing hiring for the next 2 quarters? Because we want to see what our sales ramp looks like, because that will tell us where in this model we're likely to fall and how likely it is we're going to meet our objective of being cash flow positive in the next, whatever I said in the example, 18 months. And people are like, oh, well, that kind of makes some sense. I get why you're doing that. That why makes sense to me, right? And then, you know, if your sales ramp kind of sucks and you're not really meeting the thing you thought, you're like, oh, I might be telegraphing to people something bad's going to happen. Guess what? Something bad's going to happen. You're going to start laying people off or doing something else. Like, that's a real thing. It's going to happen in that case. You know what? It's much better to have telegraphed to them that those are the principles you're operating under than have it be a surprise to them. Because guess what? They're already going to kind of know things are not going great, and they're just going to invent things that aren't true. Hybrid work, or RTO. This is a good example of where top-down planning will fail. I'm going to tell you right now, the only top-down model you can impose here that makes any sense as a declaration, meaning that you can actually have any chance of enforcing, is everyone's going to be in the office 5 days a week, thanks. That's it. Anything other than that is going to get dominated by edge cases and uncertainty. So if that's not going to be your model, don't try to prescribe all the rules. So I'll tell you what I tell my team. Our rule is be an adult. If you find you're the only person on Zoom during your team meetings, you know, your Agile ceremonies or whatever, you need to ask your team, am I causing more friction, right? Or am I participating in the way I need to be participating? Like, be a good team member, be an adult. I tell my team, if you don't think on average over the course of a quarter or two that you're going to be in the office, say, 3 days a week, please raise your hand and volunteer for a hot desk instead of a permanent seat. Don't make us staff to 100% capacity if we're only going to have 40% utilization, because that just makes us spend money faster into the future. See slide A. Be an adult. That's our model. Be an adult. And if you habitually cannot be an adult, you probably don't belong here, and we'll talk to you about that. That's it. That's the policy. That's a principle and a set of objectives, and they can reason forward. I'm going to skip this one just because of time and get to something a little more pedantic, right? All those things are sort of extraordinary, like we don't hope to have 40-year inflation every year, so we hope that's a reasonably once-in-career kind of event. This, however, happens all the time. There are really kinds of 2 reorgs that happen. Reorgs always cause uncertainty for people, so this is a good rife example to talk about. The first, I call the type 1 reorg, is the something's broken reorg, right? These 2 teams are not talking well to each other, or interaction's not happening. I know what, let's go put them under one leader, they can go straighten this out. Okay, the way to create certainty for people here is to be continually communicating that the teams are not working well together. Like, it shouldn't, the announcement of the reorg shouldn't be a surprise to people that these 2 teams, in this hypothetical example, are not doing so great to one another. You shouldn't be afraid to say that, right? Hey, my, product operations and agile teams, to, pick 2 that are kind of adjacent teams, are not talking to each other well because I'm not getting this outcome. Go off and fix this, please. I would like to get this outcome better. And then a little while later, still not talking to each other well, kids, like, you have not fixed the problem, please try this again. And then eventually when you get to the place where, you know what, I'm taking the 2 of you and I'm giving you to this leader so they can go straighten this out, it won't be a surprise. And they may not have predicted that would have been your thing, but no one will be like, well, I'm shocked to hear that things were not going well. We need to be more open and direct with people when things aren't going well, because it makes it easier for them to predict what we're going to do, and it will unsettle them less. And the last one, the type 2 reorg. We're going to reorg because somebody fulfilled their lifelong dream of not working here. You can't predict that in the future, right? But you can model your principles in this case. Hey, Fred left. Instead of backfilling his role, we're going to take his team and add it to Sally's portfolio because we think she has high potential and want to challenge her for growth. You know what people learn from that? Holy crap, they like investing in people and challenging them for growth. That's a good thing. That's a good message. You want people to hear it. So this is a case where they couldn't have predicted this because you couldn't have predicted it. You didn't know Fred was going to leave. But you can model your principles, right, and teach these things to people how you reason. All right, quick summary, and then I'm off the stage. How humans work, we do two things: keep the lights on and predict the future. Anxiety is the price of intelligence. And our job is to lower anxiety by making it easier for our people to predict the future. The why is the most important thing. Spend all your time on that. You are responsible for principles, objectives, incentives, and tie-breaking, and everything else goes to the edge. As George Box said, this model is absolutely wrong. I'm sure it's wrong. I will be here all day. Please come tell me why it's wrong, but that's how, if you don't get a chance to talk to me, you can reach me to yell at me about it. I apologize for being a couple of seconds over. Thank you for being an attentive audience while I fire hosed a bunch of stuff at you. Thanks.